Good afternoon or morning, everybody. It's good to be back together again for our next lecture. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, but I have a prior obligation, and I wanted to record for you some parts of our lecture that we normally giving on this day. And so, as part of that, I wanted just to kind of walk you through some of the plan for this session. First, we're going to be recording this as three different videos. Part one is going to be talking. I'm just going to do a brief reflection on game reports, field trip questions, the IQ question, problem space, MDA. Part two, which is going to be a second video in this section, is going to be a connecting the dots. We're going to go back to ADDIE model a little bit. And then part three, I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of SketchUp and talk about some team design time. And for those of you who are doing your presentations today, remember to please record yourselves giving your game diary reports. Remember, these are 5-minute presentations, and everybody else, please make sure to submit your reports online. The criteria for those we talked about in the first class, if you want to review my slide notes from that, or they're also going to be found in the syllabus. So please make sure you submit that by 3 o'clock today, and especially the people who are doing those presentations. So let's kind of get into it. And we're going to first start by talking about a little bit about the field trip that we just went on. I hope you enjoyed it. It's the first time we've been to the Maryland Science Center. In the past, previous classes have gone to another museum called the Baltimore Museum of Industry. This year, Dr. Schaff and I decided to mix it up and go to a different space. You know, it's a really cool, unique science center. It's a really good one. It's huge, and it gives students the ability to do have experience with and contact with lots of different kinds of scientific fields. And so hopefully you found something of there with your exhibit design that spoke to you and is meaningful for you. And I also want to say, you know, when you go into your careers, whatever it's going to be beyond Hopkins, keep in mind that, you know, we don't always work for ourselves. A lot of times, if you're working for a company or a firm, you might have a customer like the Science Center who's going to ask you to design something for them. And so this experience and this assignment have really been designed to give you that experience of working for a client. And I'm seeing the exhibit in the space and the Science Center as a whole kind of is this entity that you have to generate some kind of work for. So I hope the experience is kind of beneficial from that. We're also going to have a brief discussion about navigating problem space. I'm going to share a little bit about that. And we're also going to review mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. So let's start talking about the Maryland Science Center. So first thing I'd like everybody to do is I'd like to get some of your thoughts down before I start getting into my notes. What I'd like you to do is make sure that you review, take a look at your notes and from our field trip, and then I want you to take a minute to brainstorm what kind of game you would design. So you know, you're working in teams, but I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to kind of get out of your head what your vision is, and then think about what you might want to say to your teammates. So this is an opportunity again for you to each share your own unique ideas, and then once it's out of your head, you'll be better equipped to talk to your teammates and think about how to best blend your ideas together. One thing that's really helpful when you're doing this is to think about how fast is your game played. So there are some exhibits at the museum, especially like in the math section, that involve like these kind of colors and tiles that people dance around and that kind of thing. Or maybe you would have something like the building section where kids are stacking different blocks to make their own structures. Those are relatively fast activities for kids to do. And as in they can kind of get in, they can do their thing, and they can kind of get out. Games move at different speeds, and I would encourage you to think about how fast you want your gameplay to be. Some of you in class have talked about, for example, that you're interested in strategic play and long-term world building games, and those kinds of games take a lot of time to play and take a lot of time to go through. That's different from a game like Spot It, which is very fast. So think about how long does your game take to play, and is it a complex strategy, or are we talking about something with reflexes? And also think about, you know, this is kind of going back to David Parlett for a second. He talks about the game equipment and what kind of game equipment does your game involve? Is it big? Is it like, you know, like a sport where there's lots of balls and large objects they have to move physically around through space? Or is it you're imagining something that would be um, used on a very small scale, like dice and cards and timers and markers? Now, we are building game boards here. That is it. But keep in mind, even just because you're building a game board doesn't mean that some of the game can't take place outside of that space. You might decide that you want to have someone bounce a ball and then go back to the game board, and those two things have been integrated. I'm not sure how you'd like to do it, but it's up to you. But what I want you to do is take a minute. I want you to go to this and go to session 4, and you're going to see down here this discussion, reflections on the Maryland Science Center field trip. I'd like you to take a few minutes and reflect on these 3 topics, get your own personal idea out of your head and post it here. And that will give you an opportunity to reflect on the experience, but also give you something to talk about. All right. So I want you to pause the video for a second and then come back and do that activity, and then we're going to move on. Okay, welcome back. So now that you've had an opportunity to get some of your own ideas out of your head and you've written down written them down in the discussion forum, I want you to kind of think about some of these are the questions that I posed in our previous session to get you to think constructively about converting the process of converting a museum exhibit into a board game. And again, this is all designed to get you to start to think creatively about the process and also think a bit critically about the process. And so, I want you to think about, for example, where is your exhibit situated in the larger set? So we went to the different sections of the museum, and you had an opportunity to see, say, the medicine section, or see some of the math section, or see some of the areas that focus on dinosaurs or whatever. And within each one of those is a separate little exhibit that hopefully you've been focusing on. And I want you to be thinking about, where is your exhibit placed within the narrative or in the story of those larger places? So when people move through a museum, they're getting multiple pieces of information. It's taking them through a narrative that's kind of helping them understand a bigger concept. So where does your exhibit exist within that larger place? And think about, who is your exhibit designed for? Most of the Maryland Science Center is really targeted towards elementary and early middle school students. It can be for other grades, but if you look at the way that it's been laid out, the fact is, like, some of the manipulatables are designed for are designed for smaller hands to easily grasp and move. Um, I would argue that the Science Center really is designed to be catered towards elementary school and middle school kids, which makes sense. So, but within that, who exactly do you think your exhibit is designed for? And what activities does the exhibit have the people do? Are they trying to solve a problem? Are they trying to build a structure? Are they trying to think critically about something that has happened? And another suggestion I would suggest is that imagine you could take your exhibit and scale it way down. Imagine you could shrink, say, the dinosaur exhibit down to something about this big. What would it look like? And then how would it look on a game board? And when you think about them and these questions, in these kind of contexts, it helps you start to see, oh, I see how this, okay, you have to move over here in the exhibit and then touch this and maneuver that, and then get you there to get some kind of result. How can we replicate that in the game board? And then another thing to think about is, are there any artifacts? Are there any elements of the exhibits that you could turn into game components? Remember, game components can be cards, they can be pieces that you move around the board, game equipment. They could be dice, they could be timers, anything like that. Is there something already there that you could shrink down and then somehow incorporate into the game? Are there any rules that already exist on your exhibit? Some of them, for example, a learner has to stand in one place and then look over here or pick this up and then think about something, and then something else can happen. Are there any rules that already exist within the exhibit? And then are there any ones that could be converted or adapted into your game? And then finally, is there any cultural significance to the way your exhibit is presented? Keep in mind, this is primarily an American audience that's going to be mostly visiting it, but people from other countries visit as well. And so games are cultural objects. And so it's really critical that we start thinking about, what is the significance? What is the point of view or the perspective that the designers had when they put those exhibits together. Um, and then what are the learning objectives of your exhibit? And so all of these questions are kind of leading us down this road where we're thinking critically about learning objectives. And learning objectives are that essential piece of any lesson that deeply informs us about what a student is supposed to take away as a result of doing this experience or seeing this exhibit or visiting this place or playing this game. What do they now know that they didn't know before? That's a really critical question. And that's something that the people who built those exhibits really struggled with. They knew the scientific concepts they wanted to cover, but they didn't necessarily know how to turn it into an exhibit that a student could actually walk away with something, with a piece of information they didn't have before. So it's important to think critically again about the exhibits and say, okay, what are they really trying to teach here? And then how do I translate those learning objectives into my game board? And then the other component of that, of course, is assessment, right? We need to know, how do we assess the student knowledge through gameplay? Now, a good game designer, and I'm going to talk about this extensively later in about assessment model, but a good game designer is intentionally to have the player do something or perform an activity that gets them into a win state, and that win state is accessible. So let me say that again. So good designers are trying to think about the win states, things that people do that allow them to progress or win within a game. And then their person achieves a win state. That means that they have gained successfully a piece of knowledge or they've done a correct activity. In this case, a lose state would take them backwards. So for example, let's say if we were taking something like let's say we were taking something like one of the exhibits that focuses on uh, uh, hearing. And what the activity was the person had to understand, had to stand in the exhibit and try to picture which direction is the sound coming from. Well, if we wanted to somehow to win or achieve in that direction, there might be some kind of thing at the very end of the activity where a student has to say, I think the sound came from here, and they have to raise their hand or they have to step in a certain direction or do something physical that shows that they've moved, that they've correctly understood the question in front of them. So it's really important that we start to think about this. And I'm going to talk about this more extensively about assessment models, but think about pairing win states with achieving a learning objective and lose states with failing to achieve a learning objective. I also want you to think about, hopefully you've had a chance to review a little bit of the text. This is really a remarkable book. And as I said, I've tried to teach this class without this book in the past. It did not go as well. This book is really a wonderful resource for trying to find some of these things. And what I want you to start to do now is to start going through the textbook and going through your notes and trying to figure out, okay, how can I align what I'm trying to do within my game with what I learned about the exhibit, and what are the elements of the exhibit that say might, for example, might work in something like, is this one thing, or is this something that one person does by themselves, or is this something that they do in a group? And so, for example, I've turned to the page 12, which talks about solo games, and pages 12 and 8, which talk about team games versus solo games. And so one thing to consider is that maybe your game is not designed for a large group of people. Maybe it's designed for one person. And you can identify what the game mechanics are by examining the textbook and say, okay, what are the aspects of a team game versus what are the aspects of a solo game? And so reviewing the podcast will give you some good background information about that, and hopefully give you some good context. We're going to talk just in a minute about McCall, and I'll come back to that, but hopefully you've had a chance to read that as well. So again, when you're looking at the textbook, this is kind of a good way, this is kind of what I talked about earlier, but a good way to identify how to use this textbook is to start with things like, find a chapter or concept that you want to work with, identify what is the description of the game mechanics within it, and then identify some examples of games. So this is a good way to kind of figure this out. And you can also go the other direction. You could start, hey, what are some games that I really like? And if you turn to the back of the book, there's a whole index of game types, and you can look through your I don't know how many are in here, but there's a lot. And you can say, okay, what's a game I'm familiar with? And then kind of reverse engineer it and go back from what is the index down here. Then you can start to look at, okay, what are the structures? And then where does it exist within the chapter concept? And this is kind of a useful way to kind of go back and forth between the two modalities to figure out what works best for you in designing your game and helps you with your thinking process. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the MDA model again. And one of the reasons I want to keep focusing on this is because the MDA model is essential. It's the essential model I use in this class. If you don't understand MDA, you're going to struggle for the rest of this class. So I really want to drive this in. And the MDA model is used in crafting all kinds of games and board games and video games. And you're going to hear designers talk about this a lot, but it's really critical that we understand what it is and how it works. And with the MDA model, what we're really looking at are the M, mechanics, D, dynamics, A, aesthetics. And again, the mechanics are verbs. They're the running, the skipping, the rolling, the finding, the stealing, the buying, the selling. Whatever you can use as a verb, that's a mechanic. And they're just single activities. It's not complex. The mechanic is designed to be a singular thing that talks about one specific activity you want the person to do. I want them to find. That's a mechanic. I want them to sell. I want them to buy. I want them to uncover. I want them to trade. Whatever the mechanic is, that is the singular granular concept that you want them to do. Dynamics are when you combine two or more mechanics together. So a dynamic is something like running plus jumping, buying and stealing, finding and losing. When you take two mechanics, put them together, that gives you a dynamic. And the dynamics are where our strategies come from. So again, I've talked about in different classes about how the game Mario, right, works is where you have to run along and then you also can jump. Those are your mechanics. Running, Mario can run, Mario can also jump. When you combine them together, running plus jumping, that is your strategy. There's a certain right time to do the dynamic. And if you use running plus jumping combined together at the right time, what that does is it allows you to achieve a win state or a lose state. Maybe you jumped too early and you ran into the Goomba, and that's the little turtle thing, or sorry, the little mushroom thing. Maybe you ran into a pit instead of jumping over the pit. So learning when to run and jump together gives you the dynamic, and that's your strategy. When do you do that? The third thing is the aesthetic. And the aesthetic, again, is not about beauty. A lot of times we think about aesthetics as how pretty something is or how attractive something is. In this particular case, the aesthetic is referring to the emotional state of the player. And as game designers, we're always concerned about that because we always want to make sure that we're controlling the emotional state of the player as much as possible. And when a person achieves a win state, they're going to get an outcome that is an aesthetic. So it can be something like they feel happy or excited or elated, or they can feel that they've achieved something if they do well. If they run, they jump, and they jump over the pit, and they land successfully, that's going to give them an emotional feeling. Oh, I made it over the pit successfully. I'm doing great. I'm feeling happy. They run, they jump, and they fail, and they land into the pit. The aesthetic state is they're going to feel frustrated. And we, again, can, as I've talked about in class, we can manipulate that. We can adjust that. And by adjusting the mechanics and the dynamics of the game, when do things happen and how does the strategy work within a game, we can control the emotional state of the player and the sense of achievement. So again, that's just a quick overview again of the MDA model. Please make sure you understand this. And if you're not sure, reread the article, come and talk to me, review previous slide decks. This is a really important one to get right. And again, So mechanics are rules and basic gameplay functions. Dynamics are the way they actually advance when the rules and gameplays are function together with players' actions, strategies, and chance. And aesthetics are the emotional response in the player as they interact with the game. This is not how they feel about the game overall. This is how they feel each and every single moment in the game. And we can control that. And one of the things I want to point out to you is I believe it's important enough to include it as two of the points that we use, and two of the criteria that I'm going to really be looking for when you develop your minimum viable product development for your game, for your board games. This is, again, these are some of the criteria that you're going to be looking at when you develop your board games. And you're going to see this again in the simulation and in the board game. So it's really critical to understand this. If you can't figure out how this works, the rest of the game won't make sense, or the rest of the simulation won't make sense. So again, what are game mechanics, the verbs? How do they lead to game dynamics? You combine the verbs together. And how do they lead to player aesthetics? And that's the emotional state of the player. All right, I think I've said enough about that for right now. Let's move on. So I also want to talk a little bit about problem space. And we're going to take a look at this one. This is going to be in your IQ cards. And I want you to think about what problem space is, and hopefully you've read the McCall article. But problem space is really defined by the American Psychological Association as the mental representation of a problem and all the potential paths to solving it. Games thrive on presenting and asking players to solve problems. As we talked about in the first class, we have an intrinsic need to solve problems and overcome challenges. That's part of our human nature. Over the years, there have been many games that have been designed to teach about historical problems or historical time periods. And we need to understand this because understanding the problem space helps us understand, it gives us a mental framework for understanding how the game's going to work. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of historical games. But we're going to see for just a sec, just to kind of as an example, but we're going to talk about how this is applied to other forms. So, and as McCall, many games take place in different periods of time when people need to be task oriented. So some of you might with this game Risk. If you're not, the basic concept is very simple. You have an army, the other player has an army, and then you try to take over different parts of the world. And that's kind of what we're seeing here on this different space. And so a player needs to conquer all the parts of the map. They need to find resources, build a city, protect citizens, and provide means for a population to improve themselves through technological innovations and build agrarians, so forth. And this is kind of an older version of Risk, so it's not really showing all of that, but there's lots of that you need to do this kind of thing for. And all of these things involve the players going through task after task in order to ultimately win the game. And as part of the play experience, players need to understand the problem space their characters whacked in. What are their constraints? What obstacles they need to come? What resources or abilities do they have? Now, in order for the game to feel authentic, those conditions period of history that the game is set within. This one seems to be set around the French Revolution. If the game is such as Risk, such as this one, which is entirely about capturing as many countries as possible using your army, it confines the players using the weapons and tactics of the 1800s, and the players are uniformly confined within those limitations. The fun of this game comes from beating your opponent by successfully or using superior tactics, capturing more resources, making alliances, and so on and so forth with other players. But there's kind of a problem, isn't there? Sorry. Skip ahead. Can anybody see a problem in the problem space in here? I'll give you a minute to look at the game board. So this is the picture of the game board of the Risk game. And can anybody picture a problem that might we might say about that might be highly inaccurate? If we're going to use this as a game to actually teach students something about, warfare in the 1800s, what's a historical inaccuracy you might see? Well, I hope one thing you might have noticed is that the orange team only needs a few soldiers and two cannon to defend their entire section of the game board. And, could the blue team advance almost entirely on foot uh, to attack the orange team with only like three guys and two cannons, right? Is that even realistic? This is the United States. This is hundreds of miles. This is about, this is hundreds of miles long. And so, and then this green team, which seems to be mostly north in Canada, would they even know during the 1800s where these people are? They'd have no idea. And so, for this particular game to work, you, as the commander of the orange team, or the blue team, or the green team, need near godly powers of sight to know where the other players are and know where your army is in order to conquer them. In real life, did the commanders from the 1800s have this kind of ability? Of course not. There's simply no way that five people in, or one, two, three, four, yeah, five guys in Canada could move hundreds and hundreds of miles down here to attack five other guys who are defending the entire eastern side of Canada and the United States. In order to do the task, the games to do the task, which is to conquer these different areas, the player needs to have knowledge and abilities that the real commanders did not. This creates a conflict between the game designers who are trying to teach, who are designing historical games to be fun, and the history of the teachers who are trying to teach this game about real life and real events that actually took place. And why this concerns us is because, well, you're taking a course on gaming and simulation here at the School of Education, not at a game design school. So historical accuracy matters because it matters to the teachers. It also matters because it directly impacts the learning objectives. We can't have students walking out of a classroom thinking that the entire war during the 1800s of the French taking over part of the country was done by five people. That's not realistic. I also want to say that that accuracy will matter to the people who are going to be interested in buying and selling your game that you're designing in the game in the lobby store at the science center. Those two things, you can't build a game that's inaccurate and expect it to be sold as if it's completely true. So as game designers, one of the things we do is we make the abstractions, right? We know that there were not really five guys up here and five people over here and five people over here. We know that's true. And probably the people understood that when they were even building the games. But it's really important to think about what we're abstracting and what information we're abstracting. And so in this case, this might, this army up here might be, thousands of troops, but we need to make sure that we're communicating that to our learners as part of the experience so they don't take the mistaken approach that it's only five people up here. All right. So it's important to think about those kinds of abstractions. And let me give you a different kind of example, for example. So here's it's not just about histories. And, here's another issue from microbiology. And so we've discussed his problem spaces in terms of historical examples, right? A problem space we just gave was a historical context, but here's another example. On the left, I'm going to play a little video here for you, and let's take a look at it for a second. All right, here we go. So this is this is an example from a COVID simulation. And here comes COVID right there on the outside of an epithelial cell. It's kind of rolling along. It gets connected to a spike protein. And then what's going to see is once it gets connected, it's going to get absorbed through the cell wall lining. Where it can then begin viral replication. So this example is from a VER application called Inside COVID-19. And again, it's demonstrating how the COVID-19 viron enters into a cell. And we could see that this animation could easily belong in a science textbook anywhere in the country. And there's a problem with it. When we're looking at this animation, one of the things we might immediately notice is that we're seeing this as in one particle of of one single COVID-19 viron coming in, whereas really so many more of this. And also seems to be, this example seems to be highly organized. So it seems to be just kind of bumping along till it rolls exactly to the right spot and connects to the perfect spike protein. And so it can be ingested into the cell. All right. The reality is that this is not actually an accurate way to depict how it moves around. What I'm going to show you is another example over here, and this is an example of something called stochastic motion. And stochastic motion is a process by which a model where things move around in random behavior. And what you're seeing on the right side looks very chaotic. And we could think about all these blue dots as COVID-19 virons moving within space. And this little red line is attempting to diagram the motion of one virus moving within space. And so in this example, this is very hard to watch and is very confusing to try to track how this thing moves. However, this is much cleaner, but at the same time, this is far more accurate. And so if we were to try to describe this, as this would more be visually pleasing and shows us the movement of the cellular interactions within the body. I wanted to say that, the reality is this is actually far more technically accurate how it moves. And, I know the animators who made this, and, they really wanted to show the stochastic motion of it, but they simply just didn't have the computational power within their machines to show this level of motion with this level of detail. And so a discerning microbiologist would easily be able to pick up on the discrepancy, but not the casual learner. So as you reflect on your game designs, when you think carefully about how your game designs reflect the histories that you're addressing, and also the learning objectives that they're trying to show and that you're trying to do, what's the voice or what are the elements that were included in the exhibit and what was left out? And so again, let's keep in mind that games are abstractions. They're not a complete example of, they're not a complete facsimile or complete photocopy of how that works. And so we need to make sure we're addressing this by understanding what is being included in our exhibit and what's being included in our game, because there's probably parts of the exhibit you won't include. So it's important to think about what's there. And so what I want you to do, take a second and turn to page 16 in McCall's article and choose one of the problems from a list and write down at the name of the problem on your IQ card. And in one paragraph, brainstorm a way to avoid that problem in game design. This doesn't, in this case, have to be even need to be about the game you're designing, but I want you to think about critically about how to avoid problem spaces. And if you're not sure where that is, I want you to fill that out by doing in session 4 IQ card number 2. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video, and this is the end of section 1. And please make sure to do that. And we'll see you in section 2.